So this is our book club for the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and um, the members in our group are Sean Chung, Camilla, Polania, Yuhan Sen, and Grace Hamper. Uh, so the first question is, was it any good? And that is, did you come away with a better appreciation of local labor slash plant empathy? I think one thing that really made me appreciate plant empathy after reading this book is the fact that she refers to plant life with the same respect she would give when referring to a person. She mentions this in her book specifically when she talks about the story of the original man. When Nanabozo first landed on Earth, since he was the only human, he felt very lonely, but found company in nature all around him after giving all the plants and animals names to refer by. She also did a very good job of bringing the plants to life, stating that plants can actually talk as long as we're open to listening. Plants have been around for millions of years, longer than humans have. So I agree with Rob and Kimmer on the fact that it's pretty ignorant to act like we understand the world better than them. For example, one thing that really changed my perspective on trees is the fact that she explained how trees use uh, the mycorrhizal fungal networks to communicate and share water and nutrients with each other. After she said that, I began questioning whether trees can really talk.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with what you said. I really did enjoy this book because it really made me think about my connection with like nature and my surroundings. And I also agree that I really started to think about nature differently because she when she talks about plants, it's like she's talking to people or like with people. Yeah, and just like the respect that she shows plants and stuff like that, it really made me think about how I like my own interaction with the nature and stuff like that. And for example, like when she talks about the honorable harvest, where it's like you need to ask permission of the plants before harvesting. And if it's like if they decide that they don't want to give you permission, like you just walk away. I think that really, yeah, made me like think differently of our surroundings and stuff like that. Um, and I also really appreciate like how she brings plants to life when she's talking about plants and like it's kind of like she's describing like their personality or stuff like that. So it's really great. I really love that. So yeah.
Yeah, even for me, like I think I definitely agree with Sean and Camila and their thoughts. And personally, like after reading the book, it gave me incredible insight into indigenous beliefs and definitely made me question and wonder how I view plants around me and just nature around me. And I think the book in itself was an excellent window into understanding how just nature is viewed so differently when you compare our modern societal thinking with indigenous thinking. And it definitely had a lasting impact on me, and I came out of it with a much more profound appreciation for plants and empathy as well. Specifically, I think the few things that really made a big difference, not a difference, sorry, had an impact on me, or the way the author addressed plants, animals, and sort of every aspect of nature. And it did surround me with a sense of both regret, considering how easily I have looked at plants and not really given them much thought. But it also urged me to sort of do better and treat everything around me with respect. And all of the stories she mentions in the books, like the Sky Woman, or the tradition of the honorable harvest, or Nanabozo, all of them definitely made me feel closer to nature.
And I agree too. I enjoyed it. I liked reading about it, and I liked how she talked about how she referred to plants and animals, like you said, in the way you would refer to a person. And I liked that part a lot. And I went into the book excited to read it because I'm a big nature and animal lover too. So I'm not indigenous or anything, but I always liked how indigenous peoples tend to have, I mean, all their cultures are different, but they all tend to really respect nature and treat it better than mainstream culture. So yeah, so I do know a lot about nature and animals, so I had some kind of understanding of these ideas, and so, somewhat think this sort of way myself, but I still definitely came away with a better understanding of, like, well, and of course, indigenous culture, and also it was just nice to read a book from that perspective, because I never really had before. And yeah, and she did make a few points that made me think more about our relationship with Earth, and how um just because we live in a modern world, it seems like maybe we don't need nature or the earth as much because we have so much technology and so many conveniences, but she showed us that we really do, just as much as we always have.
Yeah, so the second question is, did the book have a point or thesis, and did it prove it? Um, I think the main point that the author was trying to prove was the disappearing of respect and reciprocity that was once shown by the indigenous community before Western colonialism. Uh, when our ancestors were forced to forget their own language, beliefs, morals, etc., the respect and reciprocity shown towards Mother Nature slowly started dissipating. Um, she expresses this message through vivid imagery by sharing personal stories and old teachings passed down to her by her ancestors. And all the stories she shares, whether it be personal or mythical, like the Sky Woman story, they all seem to relate to the positive experiences she shared with Mother Nature, things that we take for granted today.
Yeah, I agree. But I think honestly, especially towards like I do think this book covers like a lot of points. Like it covers, I think it covers so much. Like the colonization of indigenous people, how we treat like the pollution of our world right now with industrial waste and commercial waste, and also like just indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories, and also I think especially towards the end, she kind of brings all of it together to have like an urgency to return to the values of reciprocity and respect to the land, and how it's really important for us to incorporate those values in our day to day, because it will help us like move away from this materialistic destructive viewpoint with nature. So I think like especially towards the end, it's more of like we need to, like the point that she makes is like we need to go back to have a relationship with the land instead of just viewing it as like a waste land kind of thing of just like we're just using it to power our economy and be better and stuff like that. So yeah, I do agree with you in that point, but yeah, I just think it covers a lot of things. So I think it was really hard for me to be like, this is the point of the book, because it had so much going on. I was like, okay, I really need to think about like the overall, like what is she trying to say? But I do think like the reciprocity with the land and stuff like that, I think that was the biggest one. But yeah, I think also just like growing awareness of like uh how we've come to this point and how colonization like plays a part in that and stuff like that. So yeah.
I felt the same way because it wasn't as easy to find her thesis, because she didn't, like, the book wasn't about one thing, it was about a bunch of things that were related but were also kind of different. So in addition to writing about how we need to respect nature and the earth more, she also included a lot about her experiences as a scientist, and how um scientists seem to think that there's only one right way of learning and researching and doing things. And I think her book also was trying to show that scientists need to open their minds a little more, and just because, like, and she was saying she was doing an experiment, and one of her, like the experiment with the girl named Lori, who some of you referred to later on, and the lady they consulted about it was, well, an indigenous woman, and she said that the author said that she didn't think that woman even finished high school. So in science, like in the science field, she wouldn't really be considered a reliable source to base your information on, but in reality, she knew what she was talking about when it came to this, and she contributed to the experiment, and they ended up being right, even though they didn't do it in the traditional scientific method. And so I think she was trying to show that scientific thinking can take a lot of different forms, and that the indigenous way of thinking is just as valid and scientific as the Western way. Because if we changed our mindsets to be more like that indigenous way of thinking, then environmental problems would either just be avoided altogether or would be solved more easily. And scientists, like Western scientists, are trying to figure out and solve environmental problems now. But I think indigenous people are a lot better than they are when it comes to that, despite often being dismissed. And so I was thinking was very lots in addition to being scientific. And Kimmer said that she tries to show us that in her book in the introduction. She wrote that her book is meant to be, quote, an intertwining of science, spirit, and story. And she was hoping that the stories she gives us would be a medicine for a relationship with the earth. And so I think all this together is what she tries to show us or to prove in a way. And I think she's quite convincing.
I think even for me, like right off the bat, the book definitely covers a plethora of topics. There's so many things that she brings into the picture and just enlightens all of us, especially for people who weren't really aware about Indigenous culture. And when she talks about just how the modern industrialization, the consequences of it, then there's a part where she talks about the forceful resettlement of Indigenous people in the United States. And then obviously the attempt by the government to sort of, like almost call Indigenous culture a taboo and try to take them away from it as much as they can. However, I think in spite all of these points that she made and very successfully managed to convey, the one thing that kept sort of reaching me out when I was reading every single chapter was the overall idea of just being grateful for everything that the earth has provided us and how we constantly take, but we don't really give back. There isn't that reciprocity that everyone's talking about. And one of the best ways she sort of makes it a point as to why we should be practicing this is when she mentions how Indigenous people have followed this through ages, and this has sustained them very well. In fact, some would say even better than modern society can sustain so many of us. And she tries to illustrate like the fundamental need, in my opinion, for human beings to engage in a respectful and reciprocative relationship. And towards the end of the book, not necessarily the end, towards the last few chapters, I also think she clearly tries portraying the picture that the more we respect Mother Nature, the more we respect everything around us, the better chance we have of sort of going back to a time when the earth wasn't necessarily threatened so much by rampant industrialization and modernization.
Yeah, those are great points. Just to what Grace said, I think the segregation between indigenous and Western science is a good point. I think it was when she was mentioning asters and goldenrods, she wanted to know why they grew together and looked so beautiful together. But Western science wasn't able to answer that question for her, as they were more interested in how plants behave rather than why they behave that way. Um, like she mentions in the book, if Western science incorporated the teachings of the indigenous community, the scientific community would know twice as much. Yeah, so next question is, was the book too short, too long, too boring? Um, and then I guess we can start from left to right. So, Grace.
Yeah, I didn't think it was too long. I mean, I like reading, so I like long books. I don't mind them at all. And it was a book I enjoyed. If it was a book that I didn't like and I found it tedious, then of course it would be too long. But in this case, I didn't think it was, so I liked it. And I was looking forward to reading it because, like I said, um, I like animals and nature a lot myself. And I thought that would be a really interesting topic because I also like science and learning about how things work. But then, like I said, I always find the indigenous cultures and beliefs interesting. So that sounded like a really like the kind of book that I would really like. And so I did enjoy it when I read it. And it wasn't too long or anything.
I agree. I think I also enjoyed it a lot because I also like reading, so I don't mind like long books. But I feel like at first I was a little worried uh that it was like too much. But like when I started reading it, like like I didn't like I would read and I'll be like 300 like 200 pages in and I'll be like, oh, like whoa, I'm like almost there. So it's just it didn't really feel long. Like I feel like because every chapter is like a different story, I didn't find myself like becoming bored because it was just like even if I was like kind of like okay, this story like move on, like it would like the next story would be different. So it was like I never found myself being like bored or anything like that. So yeah, I really did enjoy just like the kind of like when it like the way the chapters are arranged, where it'd be like a story about herself like as a teacher, as a professor, and then like the next would be like about a mythical story of indigenous people. So I really did enjoy it and I didn't find it boring at all.
Even for me, when I sort of picked up the book first, I was a little worried that it would be a little too long. But again, I do have to preface that by saying that I I used to read quite a lot, but I unfortunately have kind of lost the habit of it. So seeing that many pages did seem a little daunting to me initially. But yeah, similar to Camilo, as soon as I started reading, I was deeply engrossed into it. It was very difficult for me, honestly, to sort of say that's enough for the day and like focus on other courses I'm taking. But yeah, and I think the reason for that is how the book has been written with the author, just the way she presents her ideas, her thoughts, and talks about indigenous culture and combining that with science and her scientific knowledge. I think it's wonderfully written. There wasn't a single point where I found it boring. I genuinely wanted to know more and more about indigenous practices and just these mythical stories. They fascinate me so much. And I think also the way she just describes so much of nature, it made me feel closer to nature itself. Like I could clearly, vividly see whatever the author was trying to paint. And yeah, I think the book was like of reasonable length. I don't think it was necessarily too long at all.
Yeah, so I agree with everyone. I think the book was fantastic. I gave myself about a month to read the entire book, so it wasn't too bad just reading one chapter a day. And I think what helped me enjoy the reading process more, like everyone mentioned, is the fact that she divides her chapters into completely different perspectives. So the book was sort of like a timeline of the author's life, and the positive experiences she shared with the Potawatomi people. Um, yeah, the only reason why I'd put myself on a little further to the too long end of the spectrum is because I personally don't really enjoy reading too much. Yeah, that's about it. And then the next question is, did the author cite real evidence? Not just what the author thinks and feels, and was that evidence appropriate to material under discussion? I recall the author using many sources of real evidence in her discussion with plant material. As a graduate professor of botany, she often shares stories about working on thesis projects with her graduate students. One example that comes to mind is when she worked with a graduate student named Lori, who wanted to analyze the growth of sweetgrass when it was left unharvested. A lot of people, like the dean of the school board and myself, they're all strongly biased by Western science to believe that sweetgrass that grew with no human interactions would have a better outcome than the sweetgrass that grew with when it was being harvested. But using the scientific method, Lori was able to prove that the sweetgrass that was harvested dispersed seeds and were able to grow new colonies of sweetgrass much better than the sweetgrass that was left unharvested. The author cites real evidence through one of her graduate students' projects to show that human interactions can be positive in nature.
Yeah, I also thought about that story. Just because I remember the way it was like the chapter was organized, it was like a scientific, like, I don't know how to explain, but like scientific like documents, let's say. So yeah, I think that one is a really good one. But I also thought about just like her own little experiments that she would do, like the stories that she would tell us, like one that I can remember was how she was talking about, like, as the picture that we have in the presentation, when she talks about the three sisters and how like indigenous practices usually grow corn, beans, and squash together because they kind of have this like relationship that helps them grow. So I also think that those stories, even though it's not like here's my footnote that says this can work, it's more of like here's my experiences, like here's the how indigenous practices are, and then here's how I teach my class this, and how myself, like I grow my garden and it works and stuff like that. And she also explains like how like the beans, I think it was, grow like this, like can translate nitrogen from the air and then does like a nitrogen fertilizer that helps like beans, not the beans, but corn and the squash grow. So it's kind of like she explains how they work together and how like it's kind of like a relationship that helps them grow, and she also explains how when it's grown individually, like monocultural fields, they have like issues. They have to do like fertilizers, or they have to like take out weeds and stuff like that. So it's kind of like it's not like really like here's my citation footnote, but it's because it's like the way the book is written is more like story. So it's not like here's footnotes that says scientific blah blah blah. So but yeah, I do think she cites real evidence for that stuff.
Yeah, she definitely does a good job of proving her point, even though maybe she doesn't, like you said, put a footnote or something. That's kind of the spirit of the book, not to make everything specific, strict Western science formula, but it still is definitely true. Anybody can see that she has a point. And it's kind of like I was saying before about how scientists always dismissed indigenous practices because they're not, they're just traditional wisdom and knowledge passed down orally. It's not technically scientific evidence or something. But then when you really look at it, well, it is scientific because they know about these things better than you. They successfully, they know how to plant the three sisters properly so that they all thrive rather than just doing a monoculture, which most people seem to think is the best way, even if you are a scientist. And who's the other? Oh yeah, and then the experiment with Lori where they showed how plants actually do benefit from human interaction if it's done properly. And that part actually surprised me too. I didn't. So yeah, even if she doesn't put well, like we said, footnotes, citations, things like that, she still has her point and then she proves it. And and that was because she was putting those two things together, because like I was saying, I love learning about ancient myths and traditional knowledge and indigenous culture and things like that. But then I also do like science. I like the factual side of things and learning how everything works. And it kind of bugs me because often people seem to think that you have to be either one or the other. You're either scientific and rational and you only look at facts and you don't appreciate or believe in the non-tangible things in life, or you're an artsy person and you know about beautiful things, your mind is open, but then you don't know anything about biology or conducting research. Right? The author is definitely in between, and I've always kind of considered myself in between too, because I don't see why you should just choose one, because they both have value, and a lot of her essays were about these two sides. And something she wanted to show was that there should not be two opposing sides, but they're just two aspects of life that we need to fully understand to appreciate the world properly and how everything really works. You can't really ignore one or the other. But usually the science side is given more importance, and then the more ancient, traditional, spiritual knowledge side is not properly respected, and sometimes even mocked or made fun of for not being real or just made up, or like made up by ancient peoples, and they don't take it seriously. But they seem to act like you can't be a proper scientist if you do believe in those teachings. And so yeah, she gave examples of like where she mentioned to her professor she wanted to know why certain plants look so beautiful together, why they're beautiful at all. And then the professor kind of scolded her and told her to go to art class instead. And so that was an example of how narrow-minded science people can be. They act like science is supposed to be about all questions, like science is questions, but they seem to be not interested in certain questions, which is kind of weird because it's supposed to be all about learning, and sometimes they're just so closed off and not curious about things. So yeah, she put those two sides together into a coherent whole, which is how, so that's how the book is written. I think that's how people should try and view life as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of the points being made here. And I think Sean previously also mentioned something from the book where she says that if we were to combine scientific knowledge with indigenous teaching, like you could learn twice as much. And I definitely think that that's a very valid point. I think a lot of scientifically inclined people tend to sort of view science as like the objective truth, and anything that science can't explain isn't worth your time, or it's not worth exploring. And personally, I think it doesn't make sense to do that, because there's so much evidence out there of things that happen, but science still has no plausible explanation for it. And yeah, again, like the story where she talks about how her graduate student Laurie, or how her student Laurie's research in harvesting sweetgrass, and how it's sort of different, or how differently it grows compared to how the modern way of growing sweetgrass. I remember one specific point where she sort of brought up the project proposal to the dean, and the dean scoffed at it and said, of course, everyone knows that when you harvest plants, it's worse. And like that entire story, or that entire chapter, was us um sort of going into that chapter with that idea that yeah, harvesting plants probably does destroy them. But by the end of it, I'm sure we were all pretty surprised to know that no, in fact, sweetgrass is a plant where if you harvest it and you take care of it, it actually does far better than if it's allowed to grow with no or minimal human interaction. And even in that story, when she sort of talks about just the way of harvesting sweetgrass, like harvesting the plant at an appropriate length, giving some tobacco offerings. I think all of that also sort of tie into the overall message of just, again, respect and reciprocity. Another thing I would like to add about citing real evidence per se is, I believe the author, like towards the end of the book, like after the epilogue, has this sort of like one-page note on indigenous stories where she sort of mentions that a lot of the things, or a lot of the stories and traditions she's mentioning are obviously things that have been passed down orally. There might not necessarily be published sort of journals or academic papers that talk about this. And whichever ones are, she does provide citations to those at the end of the book. But again, that sort of goes to show that just because something hasn't been published or hasn't been cited doesn't at any point invalidate its worth. And I think like this book is an amazing example of that very point.
Great. Yeah, so the next question is, did the book push the argument in new directions or beyond what was the state of the debate before the book? That is, has it had a real and positive impact?
Well, so this one was kind of tricky for me, but I found this review of the book that basically talks about previous books before the Braiding Sweetgrass and what their argument was, and then how, so basically answering the question. So what the article, what the review said is that although previous books do talk about some points in the like that she talks about in the book, they tend to be either like, because this book covers, again, this book covers a lot of points. So basically what the article says is that or what the review says is that previous books tend to only focus on one of the points or of like what she covers, and that she tends to push more the urgency for us to have a relationship with the land. Again, back to the point of us having a relationship with the land and reciprocity and responsibility of the land. So yeah, so basically what I found is that although books previous to this do have similar arguments and do push like indigenous knowledge being present in scientific knowledge as well, this book tends to do it in a different way, which is tell stories of personal stories and stuff like that. So yeah, I think, I mean, it does have the same arguments that before, but it pushes it in a new direction by presenting it differently, and like so the reader of the book can really understand the relationship that indigenous peoples have with the land, and how it can be really beneficial for us to take on a viewpoint like that, so that we can move forward to like a more ecologically conscious future. So yeah, so basically yes, but also not really, because the arguments were there before. It's just presented differently and pushed to have like a more emphasis on the human relationship with the land.
Yeah, so adding on to what Camilla said, she published a book called Gathering Moss in 2003. And from the quick summary I've read about this book, it has a really similar narrative to Braiding Sweetgrass. Robin Kimmer, the author, talks about the elegance of simple organisms like moss through a series of personal stories and experiences. So much like how it explains the symbolism and significance of sweetgrass in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and her book, Gathering Moss, she explains the symbolism and cultural relationships that are shared with moss by the indigenous people. So the book Braiding Sweetgrass also helps inspire other indigenous writers to speak of their own personal experiences. There's also a book called Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults, and which is an adapted version of Robin Kimmerer's book. It's written by Monique Smith, and she helps push Robin Kimmerer's narrative through her own personal ideas. And given that the title of the book mentions for young adults, I think the adapted version is attempting to rekindle the fire for young Indigenous adults in order to keep the Indigenous culture and beliefs alive throughout the next generation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both what Sean and Camila mentioned. And I also agree that this is a little difficult question to answer because just the whole the question being, has it had a real and positive impact? Now, measuring an impact of a book is, especially a book such as this, which sort of tells us to, care more for nature, give back. It's a little difficult to quantify an impact on that, or of that rather, sorry. But I do agree with Camila that all of the arguments sort of presented in this book were things that were sort of people were already advocating for. I think this was a very new way of doing so. I think this was just blending Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge together. I think it was a really smart way of doing that. But having said that, I don't necessarily think that this book asked questions or pushed the argument in directions that hadn't completely been explored before.
I said pretty much the same thing, and it is hard to measure the impact of a book, but I guess if you want to try, you could say, for example, that it's gotten, for the vast majority, very positive reviews, and I think it might, it is a national bestseller, so it seems like a pretty well-known book. I had heard of it before we were even assigned to reading, to pick between the two books to read for this class. I already heard of it. So it seemed like it was a pretty well-known book that people had liked and got something out of, because I don't think it would have got it if people hadn't found that. And I think her book is unique because even though there are other books on respecting nature and appreciating the environment, and there are other books about Indigenous teachings, this one, and there are books about science, this one combines all of them, and that makes it unique because she merges those Indigenous views and those environmental friendly views with traditional science, and sometimes they're opposing, but in this case they're not. And I think that was a really unique part of her book, and I don't think I've ever heard of, or certainly not have read, another book that did that in the same way, all those topics. And yeah, so she not only explains why we need to have respectful relationships with the earth, but also shows everyone that the Indigenous teachings, which have for a long time been disregarded and people tried to eliminate them, were basically right all along. So it has she has kind of like a double goal and a double impact, or like more than one message in her book, and they're all important, and I think she does a good job of showing them all and making people think differently about nature and Indigenous teachings.
Yeah, so next question is how does this book fit in with other works of the author? So what I found was that Robin Kimmerer has published several books which seem to portray a similar message as Braiding Sweetgrass. Aside from the Growing Moss book, she also wrote a book in 2021 called The Democracy of Species, where she tries to guide readers towards a more reciprocal and respectful relationship with the animate earth. And the title of the book, Democracy of the Species, makes me want to believe that this book is about the governing of the species, since democracy means government of the people, by the people. So allowing the different living species or different living species in the world to show us how to live, which is exactly what the author mentions in Braiding Sweetgrass. She says that we cannot act like we know how to live better than plants and animals who have been around for millions of years before humans existed. So we need to learn to listen to their teachings instead.
Yeah. I haven't read this book or anything, but it does, if I had to guess, I would say it would be quite similar to this one, and maybe more about how people and animals should how people should respect animals more, consider themselves to be more on equal footing with non-humans. And oh yeah, and then this book, and also this one too, because of the name Democracy of Species. I once saw or was reading something, and there was a like an article, and it had a picture of a pyramid hierarchy with a human silhouette at the top, and then other species of animals in the drawing silhouettes going down. And then it was labeled that this is how people tend to view the natural world, that humans are superior, the most intelligent, the best, we can do what we want with the earth, we can use it. And so they're at the top, their rights are the most important. And then down to like insects or something, or plants. And then underneath it, there was a circle, and it said, this is how humans should view the earth. And it had a human silhouette, a bunch of other animal silhouettes, and they were all in a circle to show they were all equal, because in a democracy, everybody should be equal and be able to speak their opinion. And so I think Kim Ware would probably have a similar view to that in this book, and reading Braiding Sweetgrass reminded me of that too.
I think the one book that I sort of was able to get a decent summary of and an understanding of was Gathering Moss, like Sean mentioned. And I found the style of writing and the tone very similar to Braiding Sweetgrass. In fact, like I think this book, just reading the summary, I think would be an excellent read as well, because it sort of, she uses personal experience to sort of highlight how moss is so important and such a symbolic plant for indigenous communities, because it sort of symbolizes new life and new growth. It makes you question like how we sort of refer to moss, an organism, like something being like how we refer to as just like a simple organism. Like we don't really tend to take a step back and appreciate how much this means for an ecosystem, especially considering, you know, like after like if there's a massive forest fire or something, after the region sort of stay, like the fires all dissipated and everything, mosses are one of the first plants to grow. They sort of stabilize the soil surface, they help retain water, and that helps more plants grow. So without a moss, a forest wouldn't be able to heal itself. And I think that speaks volumes about why she sort of, in all of her books, tries to spread the message that we need to learn from plants and the animals around us. They have far more knowledge and understanding of the world than we do. We are not as superior as we think we are. And yeah, I think like Gathering Moss conveys pretty much the same sort of message. And I think it was a delightful read. So I think Braiding Sweetgrass fits in like perfectly, considering other works that she has.
So I actually I didn't really look into other books because I saw that you guys already were talking about that. So I actually found through the Carleton like library, I found an article that she wrote in 2002 about like advocating for traditional ecological knowledge to be just as included and just as present in teaching as scientific knowledge. So basically, in this article, she just talks about what is traditional ecological knowledge and why it should be included in like classes for people that are going into those fields. And so she basically yeah, so she basically like states why it's so important, and she says that obviously it's not the same as scientific knowledge, but um, she explains how traditional ecological knowledge is more like passed down through generations and through knowing the land, as opposed to scientific knowledge. But she says like it should be as equally as important and as equally as included in academics as a scientific knowledge. So yeah, so basically that's the article, and I think it fits perfectly with Braiding Sweetgrass because it kind of is one of the things that she talks about how she advocates to include field trips for her students when she like teaches classes and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it fits perfectly with the book.
So the next question is, how does this book fit in with other recent books on the subject? So one of the books I found that is related to the book we read was written by Richard Wagamese, who unfortunately passed away in 2017, but he was one of the leading indigenous writers in North America. And one of the books he wrote is called Walking the Ojibwe Path. And from the summary I read, given by Milkweed Publishers, it illustrates an extremely similar narrative as Braiding Sweetgrass. Um, the story is given from a father's perspective who had a 6-year-old son from whom he was estranged due to residential schools. And he too talks about the importance of respecting Mother Nature through teachings passed down to him and his own personal experiences. So I think reading Walking the Ojibwe Path after reading Braiding Sweetgrass will definitely give good insight on what Indigenous life was like during and after Western colonialism. Also, since Richard Wagamese lived through the traumatic experiences of the destruction of Indigenous culture, I think it'd be very eye-opening to read about his experiences, especially with the separation from his son.
Yeah, I found a couple of books that cover related topics to Braiding Sweetgrass. But most books that I found usually tended to um like specifically cover just one of the many topics in Braiding Sweetgrass. Like I found a couple of books on trees and stuff like that, but I found one that was like really similar. It's called Sacred Instructions and the Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change by Sherry Mitchell. And the author is also Native American. And so the way that she writes her book from the reviews that I saw or like the descriptions is also very story based, very personally story based. The only difference is it doesn't have like any scientific side of it because she's not a scientist. She's not like a professor or anything like that. But her book basically just tends to focus more on like how we can change our life or how we can change small things on our everyday life to um, be more ecologically conscious. And she explains like how we need to decolonize our ideas and how basically colonization impacted ideas of ecological uh, relationships with the land. So yeah, so basically her book is also very, very heavy story based just from personal experiences. Um, but it's more of like how we can change everyday life things or how we can move towards a different future by just individual small changes.
Yeah, for me, coincidentally, the book that I was able to sort of get a nice summary on was the same that Sean did, Walking the Ojibwe Path. I think reading that, well, not necessarily reading the book, but reading the summary of that, really interested me. And I do definitely think that it is a book I will pick up and try to read. Because it talks so much about Indigenous culture and history. But yeah, one thing I would like to sort of add, and I think Camila also did mention that, like even though Sacred Instructions is probably like very close to the style of Braiding Sweetgrass, I think Braiding Sweetgrass is unique in the sense of trying to incorporate the scientific knowledge side of things as well. Especially given how science is just such a prevalent thing in our everyday lives. I think just Braiding Sweetgrass showing us that scientific knowledge combined with indigenous teachings can, or not can, does have added benefits to just either of those two things alone. I think that's one of the things that makes the book unique and also sort of sets it apart from the rest. But yeah, apart from that, when it comes to just sort of stories about indigenous culture or indigenous teachings, I think this book is very similar to the ones that are on the screen and that have been mentioned by Sean and Camila.
So, a book I thought of that was similar to it in a way, was kind of the opposite of those two, because while those ones are about indigenous culture and teachings, but not so much the science part, this one is about science, but doesn't involve indigenous teachings. So, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce the author's last name, Peter Wohlleben, maybe, but he's a German scientist and author, and he's written quite a few books. I haven't read this one actually, but I have read another one. I own it, and it was very good, and it has a similar title to this. I get it mixed up sometimes because the two titles are very similar, but I think it's The Secret World of Animals, and it's like this book but about animals. Anyway, so this one was very similar because even though he obviously includes no indigenous knowledge or traditions or anything, he argues that trees, even though everybody knows they're technically alive, he argues that they're a lot more alive than we often think, and that they can share nutrients with each other, they communicate with each other, that parent, I guess you could say, trees look after their little seeds that they spread out, their saplings that have planted nearby them, and that trees kind of help nurse sick trees around them back to health with their nutrients and the roots and everything. And this book was controversial because he was basically arguing that trees and plants are sentient, and some people, mainly scientists, have a hard time admitting that even non-human animals are sentient. So this was quite a groundbreaking thought that he would suggest this and write a book about it. But it was also very influential, and people thought it was quite amazing that because he didn't just suggest it, he's a scientist, so he had some evidence. He explained why, and it was a convincing book. And he kind of put a bit of this in his other book too that I read, and I almost it made me almost feel guilty about like pulling up a plant or something the way he was writing it. So I think Himmer would agree with him about that, because a lot of the things that she said in her book and that he said in this book would be quite shocking and maybe even seem ridiculous to a traditional Western scientist. Like, they would probably think that what you're saying is, well, like I said, ridiculous. Like, they wouldn't say trees aren't sentient, they're just plants. We have no evidence for that. But these two, they both take that controversial, seemingly slightly crazy topic, and they really make it convincing. And I think they're right. So I think it would be interesting to see them have a conversation, but I think they would agree on that. And then we have this adorable little painting of Jane Goodall, who everyone probably knows of, who was is an English primatologist, ethologist, and she worked with chimpanzees. And she actually read Braiding Sweetgrass and wrote a very good review about it. And I was reminded of her during the part where Kimmerer points out that in her ancestors' language, plants and animals, and even things like apples, are referred to in the same way as they would be, as you would refer to a human. They use the pronouns he or she, or I'm not sure if that's a direct translation, but they use the pronoun other than it to refer to a plant or an animal because they consider them to be living beings, not objects. And so when you call someone a he or a she, that gives them a lot of respect. It kind of makes them into a person. And so that reminded me about not a book, but an article I read in National Geographic about Jane Goodall, who I've read about before. And so she was researching and publishing papers on chimpanzees, but she was doing it in a way that was kind of controversial to a lot of mainstream scientists, because she was not just studying their, I don't know, their breeding or their mating habits, but she was studying their social bonds and their mental abilities. And she was trying to show everyone that chimps, like all animals, have been underestimated by humans. And so she faced a lot of criticism from scientists for some things she suggested about them. And this article was specifically about in one of, well, actually, in I think pretty much all of her work, she referred to the chimps as he or she because she was working with them. She knew whether they were a boy or girl, so she referred to them as he or she, not it. And she also gave them names to distinguish them. And it turns out this was pretty much unheard of in biology when she did that. And so some people did not respond well to it and were upset with her for referring to an animal in the same way you would for a human, and some said it was unscientific. And Kimmerer got called unscientific too by her advisor. And Goodall, of course, didn't let that influence her, and she said she was pretty sure those scientists really do know that animals think and feel as much as we do. They're just kind of scared to admit it because that would deviate from centuries of basically animal oppression by humans. And that also scientists seem to have a fear of anything that they can't prove. And in the typical way that is. And I think she was right. And I think another reason they maybe didn't want to admit it was because then we'd have to acknowledge that humans did not treat these feeling, thinking beings very well. We'd have to rethink our whole relationship to them, and we'd have to redefine it to be more like the traditional indigenous ways. And Jane Goodall didn't, I don't think she mentioned that, but it is true because, as Kimmerer points out, with her language and how they refer to animals and nature and everything, it's a lot more respectful than mainstream science is. So that reminded me a lot of Jane Goodall's work in her book, and I think they would agree with each other about that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so the last question we have is, how do your views of the book line up with reviews of this book? So I looked at Google reviews for the book, and I saw a ton of positive 5-star reviews, as you can see. And most of the reviews had the same message, which was basically thanking the author for shining a positive light towards nature, stating that they're able to appreciate nature much more and have a different perspective towards all living things. Not surprisingly, there are many Indigenous people who were also moved and motivated to learn more and spread their cultural beliefs in their language after reading this book. Having so many positive reviews, I had to do a bit of scrolling to find a negative review. One negative review I found, though, was regarding the use of grammar of animacy when referring to plants. For example, referring to plants using the pronouns he, she. The reviewer points out that the author comes up with sort of like a crazy conclusion that the reason Western society is destroying their native land is because they do not refer to plants and animals with proper pronouns. The reviewer argues that there are languages other than English, like Japanese, which refer to plants with proper pronouns and are equally destructive towards nature. So I most certainly agree with all the positive reviews reading this book, or reading this book was an eye-opening experience towards nature for me. I also agree with the negative reviewer. I think referring to plants and animals with improper pronouns doesn't really allow us to forget that plants and animals are living things that deserve respect. I think, as the reviewer mentioned, there are many languages that refer to plants with animosity and are as destructive as the Western society.
Yeah, I found a really, like, it was really hard to find negative reviews, but yeah, so basically most of the positive reviews are also saying what you said. So basically just an eye-opening experience, changing how they think about their relationship with land, which is also for me what I experienced. But one negative review that I found, honestly, it's just talking about the length of the book, and how they found it kind of repetitive, like the themes and stuff like that, and that it could be cut down, like some chapters and stuff. But I don't really agree with it. I mean, I think I just enjoyed every story. So for me, even though I could see how it was repeating, instead of being like, well, why is she talking about that again? It's kind of like, oh, now this is like a different story that also relates to that. So yeah, I do agree with all of the positive reviews, because it really did make me like think about how I interact with nature and like my actions, how it would impact just like my surroundings basically. And yeah, but like the negative review that I found, I don't really agree with it. I just think it kind of, like, for me it just kind of added like, oh, there's more things that relate to this topic, that this thing that she's talking about. So yeah.
Yeah, personally for me, again, I think the general consensus for this book was that the reviews were overwhelmingly positive. A few negatives here and there, and again, I think the positives all revolved around like the amazing insight into Indigenous cultures and norms, and how positively Indigenous people view and treat the world around them. But the book almost has an undertone of like hope, that if you sort of take care, things are going to be okay. And I also found that a lot of people tend to sort of appreciate the various personal story and the anecdotes mixed in with the scientific knowledge, because sometimes um, both of those things exclusively, like just on their own, it can be a little tiring to read. But I think sort of mixing them two together help a lot of readers feel immersed, as from what I've read from the reviews. I think one sort of review that one sort of message that I got from every sort of reviewer was that the book definitely sort of made them rethink or their own relationship with nature, and sort of made them want to treat nature with more respect. In terms of the negative reviews, one of the only ones I found were about the length of the book, and that sometimes it can be a little monotonous or tiring to read, but I disagree with that. I completely agree with what Camila was saying regarding how, even though some messages are definitely repeated, the way she sort of repeats those messages or tying in other experiences from one that she previously hasn't mentioned before. So I still think it keeps the reader very engaged. And in terms of what Sean mentioned regarding the message or the thing that the author wanted to convey, saying that referring to plants using proper pronouns helps us treat them with respect. I do see where the author sort of coming from when she makes that statement, but I do also think that it is jumping the gun a little bit, just because you will refer to a plant with the proper pronouns doesn't necessarily mean you are doing that out of respect. Some languages have had that just be a part of their script from like ages ago, and you've just sort of picked that up as just a nuance of the language that doesn't necessarily invoke more respect for the plant. So yeah, that is something I do agree with. But yeah, in terms of the positive reviews, I agree with them wholeheartedly, and it definitely made me want to be a much better caretaker of just nature around me, and makes me want to give back as much as I can.
I agree with the positive reviews too. And I didn't see many negative reviews either. Just mainly they talked about it being long, and some said it was tedious or repetitive, or she said the same thing over and over again, or that every story was the same, which I don't really agree with, because like I said before, I have no problem with long books. I enjoy long books as long as it's a good book, which I found it was in this case. And the stories weren't the same. It wasn't like it was, I mean, the messages are all kind of similar because the book has a theme, but it's not the exact same repetitive story and message over and over and over. They're all slightly different. Like one's about, like I think was mentioned earlier by someone, one's a traditional story and might be about not being lazy and helping the earth because she needs human help as well. She can't do it all on herself. And then another story will be a personal one about her with her students. And might be about her going to another might be about her going to the grocery store and wondering where all these things really came from. So they're all similar but different at the same time. And there was one other review that I saw that thought it was kind of, I guess you could say, too out there, because they said that they went into it thinking it would be kind of, this reviewer said that they figured it would be too new agey and spiritualist like for them, and then they went into it and they felt that I thought they would end up saying that it wasn't, but they said that they did find it was new age, like, I don't know if you know exactly what that is, but it's hard to explain. But he did find that it was too new agey for him, and I don't know why he would say that, because she doesn't talk about she doesn't bring up made up things. She talks about ancient traditional knowledge and wise people, and then she brings in Western science and connects them together, and she backs up everything she says with proof. So I don't really know why someone would find that it's not backed up properly, or that it's ridiculous or airy fairy or whatever they thought it was. So I didn't agree with that one. And then the other review about how saying that they thought it was unreasonable that she said that the reason we don't take care of the earth is because we don't refer to the living things with proper pronouns. I don't think that's exactly what she was saying. I mean, I think she said that referring to animals and plants with respectful he and she pronouns, or whatever, would help make you more aware that they're living beings too. But I don't think she was saying that the entire fate of the natural world rests on whether we refer to them as a he or a she. That's blowing it a little out of proportion, and she'd never said that herself. So I think if you're giving it a bad review just based on that, you kind of miss the point of the book. But it is true that other languages who have those pronouns do treat them badly. So that's not the only thing. But she never said it was the only thing.
Yeah, so this has been our presentation for Braiding Sweetgrass. Hope you enjoyed. Yeah.